this is such a tricky topic to bring up. So I'm going to be revisiting topics that I brought up that I sort of outlined, although I didn't, let's say, fully summarize and conclude and make concluding sort of remarks about. And I'm going to also add to the elephants in the room, as it were, from Sam Vaknin. So Sam Vaknin, there's a recent video on his channel, and I've only listened to, I can't really read from here, I think 24 minutes. 24 minutes out of an hour and 10 minutes, so roughly interview. And I just felt like I need to start addressing the things that Sam Vaknin is talking about, but also going back to the Dialogos session between Jordan Hall and Evan McMullen and John Vervaeke and Gregg. I don't know Gregg's surname. So this is going to be, I guess I'm going to have to ask for some kind of tolerance, because I'm not going to be able to get through these large matters without taking some shortcuts, then going back and cleaning it up to some degree. And I'm going to heavily, let's say, rely on my, let's say, Christian understanding of these sorts of things. But essentially, one of the elephants in the room is politics that we need to address. We need to understand, let's say, a good enough political structure, a hard structure of politics. And to properly assess the problem of politics, we need to understand the human condition to some degree, and we need to understand the defectiveness that the human condition is prone to. And we also need to understand this, let's say, with some kind of anthropological, historical understanding of where we come from. And I'm not going to try to say that I'm giving a faithful representation of history. I'm going to be cherry picking a narrative because that I think is the most salient thread in history. But essentially, the reason why I'm bringing this up in this context is because this is an elephant in the room in the Dialogos session with Jordan Hall and John Vervaeke and Evan McMullen and Gregg. And it's also an elephant. And then sort of from the other side of the coin, it's also the elephant in the room in the Sam Vaknin interview. Now, I don't like Sam Vaknin's sociological reduction, because I don't like sociological reductions. I think they're dangerous. And in some sense, it gives you a false reading that you've got an objective framework to deal from, or that you are contending with reality according to some objective framework. I don't think such a thing is even possible. That is, let's say, a materialist, faith-based atheism, if you want to put it like that, or something like that. What is the hope of your materialism in that sense? What are you hoping for? Because if you're not hoping for something, then how do I know if you have a good enough hope that I should even be listening to your critical thinking? But anyway, that's a general gripe that I have, and I do think that in some sense, in the way that Sam Vaknin is invoking Marxism in that sense, then it is perhaps an unknown quantity. It is perhaps also slightly dangerous. But look, I'm bringing Sam Vaknin into this picture because I think that his contribution, his intellectual insight is a good springboard to these sorts of issues. Now let me take it from the anthropological perspective, because this, I think, cuts through Sam Vaknin's narrative about this. And it's not as if Sam Vaknin's narrative is not, it's not a use, it's a useful thermometer. It's a useful barometer of the atmosphere in which we live in some sense, because let's say the atheistic materialistic thing can say, well, let's just try to deal with the hard facts and how they resolve themselves in the present, and then let us content ourselves with those elephants in the room that we essentially are stripped from, let's say, the weird contexts. In some sense it has a tabula rasa kind of vision of humanity, which is a little bit scary, maybe. I don't think Sam Vaknin is really prone to that. I mean, he would fill in that maybe with some kind of evolutionary psychology. I mean, he is in the field of psychology, but in some sense, what I think he fails to do is when he psychologizes these issues, he doesn't look intellectually. I think he's aware of this, but he doesn't advertise this as flagrantly as I hope that he might. That psychology is not a fully understood field. I mean, he quite humbly does make very clear arguments which are useful and important to make in this time of our culture and our history, that psychology is not a science. Psychology is a very strange thing, and we don't know what we're doing exactly. That's, I think, a very important contribution that Sam Vaknin has valiantly made in the field, um, into intellectualism as well. But let me just say that let us not then rest on our laurels and then have some kind of half-baked psychological narrative and then end up relying on a sociological reduction anyway. Then what are we doing? We don't know what we're doing. We're saying, oh well, this is the human condition, is that we just have to be conditioned by unknown unknowns, and so we'll just build it in. We'll just sort of fold it into the narrative, and we'll confect some best course thing or something like that. And in some sense, my biggest argument against how Sam Vaknin is talking and intellectualizing in this interview is that it's an amoral position. He's saying, look, I'm just an intellectual and I don't profess to have a moral position. And so he's giving objective so-called facts and his expert analysis from his specialization in his field. So he is, in some sense, he is trying to wear the wizard hat and the wizard robe of the scholar, of the psychological scholar. And I think that is somewhat dangerous when you don't say, well, the field itself is in disrepute, and the field deserves to be in disrepute. So everything that I must say must be taken in more than and this is why I don't like just labeling people, oh, Farage is doing collective narcissism in Britain, and that Trump is a narcissist or something like that. I mean, it may be, who cares about their personal lives or something like that. I mean, I think I can quite rightly say that Farage is a wonderful person, and Trump, his political function is the most in some sense, Trump is standing up valiantly for the values of the of the American constitutional values and the promise of the American way of life, and he has defended that. And I guess, I mean, you could say, well, maybe it's true that people want to get rid of him and they want to do something else because they know that America needs some kind of revision. It needs to go through a metamorphosis and something like that. Sadly, I think the people that want to put it through a metamorphosis are really the problem and not the solution, and they don't have enough context. So anyway, I would eagerly put myself on the side of Trump. I think that he is, whatever you might say about him personally, if you look at the line that he has taken, politically and moralistically, I think he's on the right side. Obviously, he's been decontextualized at every turn by a very corrupt fake news media. Anyway, let me not go down that rabbit hole too much, but this is, I think, when you want to be an intellectual that's not taking any sides, so that you can basically keep your audience, whatever proclivity or political, so if you want to keep the widest audience possible and you want to play the field, and you just want to be a kind of a wizarding expert or something like that, I mean, I guess that's your prerogative, I guess. But it's very clear that Sam Vaknin is, I think, operating, at least as the intellectualism that he's peddling at the moment, is a very perhaps problematic and noxious form of amoralism. Anyway, okay, I've made that point. I think it stands, and I've made this point before against his intellectualism. And this is also the problem with Marx, essentially, is that Marx doesn't very clearly, very explicitly, Marx says about his own work that he is not a utopian, and he's not saying these things for moral reasons. He's basically a sociological theorist on some level, and dialectical materialism is a kind of historical analysis or something like that. So Marx is very clearly just kind of trying to outline the need, the let's say the intellectual propensity for something like actually settling the end of history rather than unconsciously repeating, let's say, tacit inbuilt tensions within a system or something like that. Now I'm going to talk about this from the human component, because I think that this is what's completely missing. So we have to understand that, and this is the elephant in the room on the Dialogos side of this argument, is that you get Gregg, who says quite, like, well, he's almost like saying, maybe I'm putting words in his mouth, but, and I still haven't, I think I've watched an hour of that. I haven't watched the last 25 minutes of that Dialogos session or whatever. But the problem, which I don't know if it gets addressed, but the problem is that not everyone is as evolved as you are. Many people don't give a shit. They want to indulge in their decadent proclivities or whatever. And in some sense, the problem with the expansion of the res publica, it's a dead language anyway, I don't know how to pronounce it, but is essentially that many people, in some sense, should not. Okay, when I say should, I mean this very weakly and meekly. I'm making the point just to explore it to some degree. But in some sense, some people, it would be better for society at large if some people were not allowed to legally orchestrate and administer their own estate, because they're not capable of administering their own estate. They need guardrails. They need someone to protect them from making the wrong decision or something like this. And this is where, in some sense, you get the kind of the regulatory environment or something like that. Now, I do think that there are ways of having regulatory environments, and there are ways of not having regulatory environments. But in some sense, that they're always, if they are just made as a kind of as the legislature being the source of moral authority, you're going to have lots of corruption eventually. Because anyway, you need to have a legal system that's slightly more organic than that, perhaps. But in some sense, there have always, well, at least in my legal tradition, there are two tiers in the legal system. There are magistrates, which are creatures of statute, and there are high courts, where the buck stops with them. That you can really see how deep the rabbit hole goes. And so, there are some people that essentially would not be caught dead in a magistrate's court. They will simply say, no, I'm not arguing this case in the magistrate's court, or if you do, you just immediately appeal it to the High Court. Where the whole instance begins again, because then as soon as you go in the High Court, then you actually have to start the pleading process, where you don't have proper pleadings in the magistrate's court, because the magistrate's court is not a court of record. Anyway, so essentially, when you even go from the magistrate's court to the High Court, it's a fresh instance. Anyway, it's a fresh airing of the matter. It's a fresh anyway. I don't want to get into these technical things, but sorry, let me try to condense a real point here. So basically, what I'm trying to get down to is that there is actually something in the Hindu texts. What the Hindu texts talk about is that essentially there are different castes of people. In fact, there are 4 castes of people. And ironically, or maybe weirdly, I think that these castes don't actually correspond to Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. They're actually, they might have some weak correlations to those things. And caste systems are inhumane. Caste systems are definitely wrong. I just want to put that out there, that it is wrong to have a caste system, especially one in which, because I don't believe that people are just born into the same caste because their parents belong to a caste. But there is some truth to it. There is some people, you could say, would not have established their own estate. They would have become a servant in somebody else's house. That to be a servant in somebody else's house was not a bad station, was not a bad lot in life, because essentially then you would become part of somebody else's household, and you would want to become part of somebody's household, and you would you would seek to make your master wealthier because he was a good master to you and he looked after your best interests, or something like that. That essentially you would try find a nobleman. This is the nobility in that some people are more noble than others, or something like that. Now, obviously, I think that partly what the corruption is in the neo mercantile development of capitalism or whatever is that people that would have been naturally servants now can become, and I do think that there's a way of doing this, can become in almost what in Plato's Republic the dream was, is that the bronze people would actually be the richest people in society, and the golden people, the guardian class, would actually own nothing, that they would get everything for free because they just would be part of governing the society. And so the price for governance is that they would have to have no vested interest. So they could not own property, but they would have to kind of they would sort of live on, they would live on a kind of charity for the governance and the administration that they brought to bear on the state, or something like that. So I don't know, Plato's idea of the Republic is, and I think I'm so embarrassed that I don't even know this. I always get it mixed up. I mean, who wrote Nicomachean Ethics? Was that Plato or was that Aristotle? I always get so mixed up. I mean, did Plato write the Republic or did Aristotle write it for Plato? Man, I always forget stupid details. But anyway, it just shows how uneducated I am. But the point here is just that I think that this is the function of having regulations that work holistically, is that we can have our cake and eat it. We can have people that use services and use structures that have been created, let's say, in some kind of benevolent system, that there are certain limitations. This is somewhat like how did Fritzl in I can't remember the country. Was it Switzerland or something like that? Where the guy who built a basement in his own house and was able to kind of dispose of the debris because he literally had to excavate dirt, and then he hid that dirt away. I don't know. He drove it out, and then he dumped it somewhere where no one noticed what he was doing. Well, he completely built a whole basement, which then he used to imprison his own family and practice torture and incest and all manner of human rights abuses. And essentially, this was essentially because planning, like in some sense, the limitation of this would be that if he applied for building a basement, because you can't do this without a license, so in some sense, this is why we have licenses. This is perhaps one of the reasons why we have licenses, because perhaps if people are building something that looks like you could use it as a dungeon, then someone should inspect the place every once in a while, perhaps. I don't know. It sounds. Anyway, so now this is problematic because you can have slippery slopes and things like that. Do we really want a government that essentially is the nanny state here and things like that? But this is the problem: is that before, people who would only have been servants would never have had the power to orchestrate and administer their own estates in order to give themselves the room to do these and perpetrate these sorts of things. These sorts of people would never hold that kind of power, but now people who would in the past would have only been servants can now be quite rich. They can now be quite empowered and powerful. And this is a problem to some degree. Now, this is in some sense. I mean, I'm using a historical example here. It's not perhaps such a useful example, but because I mean this is a psychological problem. I mean you can also, this is why in noble families sometimes you get a child that is literally a tyrant in the waiting, and then they will lose the family fortune or they will tank everything or something like this, which is why generally the great houses would actually, you know, Julius Caesar promoted his Augustus, which was only his cousin, I believe, to be essentially the inheritor of his rank or the inheritor of his estate. And then Mark Antony tried to step in and act as a guardian until Augustus became of age, and then Augustus sort of outplayed Mark Antony by borrowing against his estate, which was in keeping, which was being kept for him by Mark Antony, who was a bit of a crook, I would say, and that sort of thing. But anyway, the whole. But the other. Let me just think that there's another kind of angle here which is important, which is I spoke about empathy. Empathy is very important because in some sense that the craft of judgment, the craft of adjudication over controversial matters is in some sense one that means that if we want to have a state that, let's say, has a practice of equality or something like that, who has equal protection under the law and laws of general application, which I think only exists in my legal tradition, by the way, but anyway, that if you have those two things that I would say generally conform to or converge into meaning that you have the rule of law, you cannot allow litigants essentially to use privacy as an excuse to. I have to be careful here because I'm not saying that privacy can't be used as a veil, but I'm just saying that you have to prove your claim. That you can't say that, oh, the reason why I can't prove my own claim is because I want to indulge in my right to privacy. It's not the court's fault, it's not the judge's fault that you can't prove your claim because you're not willing to sacrifice your own right to privacy in order to prove your claim. You still have to prove your claim, right? So don't have this two-faced, forked tongue sort of thing that no, my morals and my values are private, but I still want to have my cake and eat it. There's a fundamental mismatch here. And this is something of the general defect that we have with humanity in some sense, is that people have, maybe it's because they have been burnt by false authorities before. They've been burnt by moral authority that has dominated their lives and subjugated them and denigrated them because there was no hope of reconciliation. There was no hope of essentially attaining to a greater understanding or something like that. There was no hope of forgiveness. So within that context, you can understand why people would want to say, well, no, I plead the fifth in the American sense, or no, I invoke my right to privacy, because the state itself is not necessarily designed to be able to alleviate and discharge. But I mean, in some sense, sometimes there is patrimonial damages that need to be compensated for. But in terms of the moral value of the controversy itself, especially in the sense of criminal charges and things like that. But I mean, there are also civil wrongs which are, I think, worthy of let's say censure and rebuke. Which I think that dishonesty or untruthfulness is a threat to order, to law and order, but also to the cultural ethos as well. But in some sense, anyway, what am I getting to? I'm trying to get to the point that Okay, well, I'm just going to leave that as it was. I want what I before I started recording this, I wanted to actually have a rant against the French system of justice, where you have to prove your innocence. Now, in some sense, in the French system that you have to prove your innocence, it is somewhat trying to give the benefit of the state to the let's say the law and order, the powers that be, or something like that. That if you are being prorogued, if you're being prosecuted by the state attorney or by the state prosecutor or something like that, by someone who has an office to do so, and then you are on the back foot in the French system, you have to prove your innocence. In fact, they don't have to prove your guilt, you have to prove your innocence. In some sense, this is a system that was made for servants that have attained to a status which perhaps they do not own themselves. And in some sense, there is a realism to that, but it's a kind of lowest common denominator sort of sense. And I have witnessed the French justice system, and I must say I am disgusted. I have seen enough injustice in my life in the French legal system that I am willing to write them completely off as a failed and disgusting form of, I mean, and this is the Napoleonic corruption that I complain about, but essentially the so-called judges in the European system are, they're like mediators or something like that. They investigate themselves, so it is completely different to the British sort of system, but because they are so used to being this, having this kind of investigative role in the proceeding itself, they are captured by their own inculcated cultural proclivities and things like that. I mean, I have seen so much disgusting bias. It is unfathomable that they can even orchestrate such a disgusting system. But I mean, in some sense, you could say it rests on the character of the presiding officer, him or herself. But just such an eminently corrupt system that will actually, I mean, the procedure that can be used against you, and the, I mean, it's literally horrendous. The travesties of and what are they called? I'm just trying to think. The miscarriages of justice that such a system supports. I mean, it is like being in a den of snakes. I will say that as well. And in some sense, you have to be very careful, because essentially all you have to do is put their pride up against the wall, and you've got, and you're in a and there's something I'll say is something about the French language as well, which also bears this disgusting trait. That it's very hard to learn French, because you have to speak it the way that the French do, because it doesn't have, everything that you can say in French can be incredibly rude, essentially, unless you because it's not the words. The phrasing is so important in French. It's very strange. Things don't have ordinary meanings. They have connotations, and so you have to be naturalized in it in some sense. Um, you have to localize yourself. You have to fit in to how it is being used at that time and place, and the fashion changes, and every word in French can essentially have some kind of sexual connotation to it. It's crazy how many that, and so all these words that have, anyway, there's this symbolic concatenation within French that forces you to be on the same page, as it were. And so you can't make very sharp, nuanced distinctions. And I know that that's going to sound somewhat ironic, because the French are famous for, if you'll, I know I'm being very insulting and I apologize, but essentially they're half-witted intellectualisms, and they're kind of, they're half-witted, backhanded, because in some sense, because of the symbolic meditation that their whole language and even legal system is built upon, they can kind of they can see the structure of injustice in a very structural sort of way, because that is how their system functions. Um, and so it's a very mediated political, you know, it's this very homogenizing kind of force, and it's very hard to be a discerning individual in France. Um, you pay for it. You know, you'll be rejected. You will be shunned. Um, and I know that that sounds very ironic, but in some sense, you won't be shunned as long as you accept their system, as long as you are standing on the shoulders of what they have already assimilated and reaching forward onto new conquest of more intellectual vistas, to be purveyors of, or something like that. They don't want the chain to be broken, because it's a kind of symbolic concatenation that they are all, and they're not willing to repudiate Napoleon, or at least they're not willing to repudiate the system that they have inherited from Napoleon. And you know, there are lots of schools of thinking and intellectual what I'm just trying to say in a roundabout way, because I also mentioned it in the last recording, that there's this conceit within the French culture, and when it, especially when you see it in other places, when you see it in the Cajun South in America, you can just see how toxic it manifests itself. That it's very happy to just kind of be self-satisfied with this homogenous kind of superficial. Anyway, I'm being a bit too vague now, and I'm not extracting the principle of it well enough to continue this tirade and ranting. So I do apologize for being so imprecise. But yeah, so it would be easier for me to extol in some kind of dialogue, perhaps. But what is my point? Should I go back to narcissism? What were the other elephants in the room? Yeah, so I think that, I mean, Sam Vaknin would also bring this up in other points, but essentially the idea that we cannot even just say, well, narcissism is evil. We have to understand that there is such a thing as benign narcissism, and that's, let's say, healthy boundaries to some degree, because in some sense, when someone has knowledge that you do not, they possess responsibility that perhaps you do not, and they possess control that you do not, and that these things are like the I believe this might be the Scientology triangle: knowledge, responsibility, and control. These things, each one is the other two. Control and responsibility is knowledge. Knowledge and control is responsibility and uh, uh, control and knowledge is responsibility. Hmm. Yeah, I don't know if I said all the permutations, but anyway, um, I was going to make some kind of historical parallels as well, though, to the idea of look, I mean, symbolic morality in some sense is very useful when you're dealing with people that are not at a level at which that they can have, let's say, a thinking understanding. I mean, there are types of people that need to relate to these things in different ways, because they are, you know, I could use MBTI, Myers-Briggs type indicator typology. You know, they are people that have different ways of relating to the world and understanding things. Um, they have different tone arms, they have different egos, and they need to understand things according to how their ego um, can relate to things. Anyway, it's essentially, it is your own ego that has to essentially at some point develop your own unconscious side of the mind and navigate you out of the unconscious side of the mind or something like that. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about the developmental process now, but man, I'm jumping all over the place. Okay, let me just think if I've kind of accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. Is the idea that we have a problem with the individual in society is basically my general point. Is that the problem, we should not think of the problem as a sociological problem. It maybe has a sociological manifestation, but the real problem is in the individual psyche, and that they are different types of individual psyches, and we need to get to grips and work out how to, in present time, coordinate, collaborate, and also to be able to navigate through controversial waters and incidents of disjointed discombobulation and disintegration and contracts that have not been honored and things like that, resolution to things. But in some sense, there are two tiers, I think. I mean, I, in some sense, in the secular sense, I want to criticize legal systems and psychology because I think that those are a source of corruption and evil in the world. But in some sense, just reducing that evil does not mean that good things will happen. You also need to have a positive motion in some sense. You need a positive purpose. You need a positive framework. And these things, I think, should be kept distinct. I think that these two, that the state must be ironed out into we need an apostle to the nations still, I think. That we have lost that. The Pope is I mean, I don't know what the Pope is supposed to even be. The Vicar of Christ, I don't even know what that means. But I mean, where's the Pauline apostle? Where's the apostle to the nations now? How many apostles are there in the Catholic Church? Well, anyway, there's no point in talking about that because I don't think they have any. But so these are matters that need rectification, as it were. I mean, I don't know if it's... so I said all this weird stuff about myself at the end of the last recording, and it is a very awkward thing for me to say those sorts of things, because, and I think I did answer my own problem, because I said, look, if people are telling stories, then come and tell your story, but otherwise, we don't care about stories. We care about practical matters. We care about justice. We care about knowing things in a secular way, and I think that is important. And if we want to discuss poetry and lineage or whatever, maybe we can all tell our own interesting stories about, what has been passed down in your family line, perhaps, or something like that. And who knows how much of that is important or not. I mean, I personally don't even believe that necessarily things are passed down. I think things are passed down in a spiritual way. They're not passed down in a material sense necessarily. The analogy of how I talked about Phoenicia and Greece and essentially the being a father city and a sister city, and then there being something in between that then grows up in another place. Seeing the synthesis of these two, perhaps, that essentially you can have something which is a thesis and an antithesis and then a synthesis, and then the synthesis goes on, and maybe that's where the spiritual fruit grows. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, but it does fall away from the tree. Might be a kind of interesting thing as a thread to follow that. But to understand the kind of rivalry between Ishmael and Jacob, and the strange mixing of the lines between Esau and Ishmael, and then Isaac going another way, and then you have, this blood feud in the sons of Abraham, and then, you have these Gentile people, because I do think that the Pauline apostolic line of succession had something to do with also the hidden covenant. But anyway, this is my crazy religious ramblings or whatever. But in some sense, it's my own answer to this is that this is not relevant to the actual work that needs to be done at the table, as it were. And I do think that at the end of the day, we have to understand what's going on psychologically so that we can hope to design something that can actually be a viable alternative to market relations in some sense. Because, in some sense, the market is not a permanent thing. The market can very easily be obviated. It can very easily be, you can create an alternative to it. The question is that will that alternative be sustainable? I mean, we have already created, to tell you the truth, I do think that if you just created a good court, an actual court that would actually resolve issues, that would evolve the whole of humanity. That would, just having a righteous court, or just having a court that actually had justified judgments, just getting justice right, doesn't even have to be in every nation of the world. Just having an example, just having a model of how it's done, just having a model jurisprudence, that already would evolve, I think, everything and everyone to some degree. If you want to, to use the analogy of in Star Trek, where they say, no, we are evolved humans. We're not the same as the humans that used to exist. We are evolved humans. What does that mean? They never really explain it. They still have problems. Jean-Luc Picard goes back home, and his family has problems. These are people that still have problems, but they're evolved humans. What does it mean? What does it mean? What is different in their society? They got something right. They got some knowledge right. They got some justice right. They got some value system right. They've perfected morality in some way. And not perfected it in a way that, these are the commandments. They perfected it in the process of it. And does that mean that the Federation is not prone to being taken over by parasitic aliens? No. Doesn't mean anything like that. It's still vulnerable. There's still a humility. There's still a, it doesn't end history, but it ends something noxious about history. Anyway, this is my vision, at least, of how these things are resolved. That you line up the elephants in the room and you dismiss them, because now we've actually got a positive structure that covers this, and we put a disc on top of the elephants, and then we've got a brand new edifice upon which to live, and then that is how we become evolved humans. Because we graduate past those elephants in the room, and we use them as part of the supporting structure of the new system, as it were. But anyway, and I think that the system doesn't have to be entrenched in municipal law. It can be entrenched in a freeman society. It can be entrenched. It just has to model itself, I think, to some degree. It doesn't. To be a model culture, the culture. Anyway, this is my rough vision, and in some sense, I would not presume to demand that America should change its system. I would presume to open a free line of advice and say, well, my opinion is that your system is fucked up, and it's broken, and it's defective, as I've even tried to rant against the French system, which I think is wholly defective and, in fact, an evil and wicked system. But not without perhaps its fruit, though, not without its insight. I do think sometimes we need to develop the poison so that we can develop the antidote, as well. It's part of, maybe the French, I do think that the French were somewhat the antithesis of the feudal system, and the feudal system did need to end in some way, and that was the French developed the antithesis, the vaccine to feudalism, and it was a poisonous vaccine. It itself had a too much of an overreach, too much of an overcorrection. Anyway, I'm really going all over the place, but I mean, I really should be. Yeah, so I'm talking about this big, lofty, almost pseudo-religious narrative, but what I should be doing is really contenting myself with a kind of psychological issue more. But yeah, I should really finish my book so I have something to stand on, perhaps. To say, go read that and you'll realize what I'm talking about, or something like that. But yeah, so this is my warning against, I think, some of the reductionism that Sam Vaknin is talking about. And he's not necessarily irresponsible in doing it, but I do think that he is somewhat, ironically, standing in the narcissistic intellectual French tradition of intellectualism. I do think Sam Vaknin takes his materialist or amoral philosophical perspective from the view of an a la carte. He will quote Christian scriptures. He will quote. He will rely on Christian motifs even. Sam Vaknin is a very intelligent person, but I do despise his amoralism. I do think that he does a disservice, and I know why he does it. Is because if you don't act that kind of intellectual, you can't survive as an expert in that field. They will tear you apart. They will destroy you. They will destroy your reputation. They will take everything away from you because you're not part of the Tower of Babel. Essentially, you are trying to do something else, and you're going to be too divisive to their system because you're going to sort of. Maybe I'm slightly speaking out of turn, and some of these comments are slightly misplaced, but I think symbolically, at least, that's the kind of impression that I get, is that there's a dangerous acclamation that is happening here, which is essentially that you have to homogenize your form of intellectualism with a system that is entrenched in a kind of false authority. And a lot of that is cultural, is a kind of tacit cultural confected poison. I mean, this, I guess, has a lot to do with, let's say, the idolatry of heritage, I think, to some degree. And I'm perhaps afflicted from this myself, and I am very conscious of this affliction. I mean, you could say that I have a messiah complex, and I am very eager to disabuse myself of this, and I'm very easy to wear it on my sleeve, and to say, be wary of me, and because I can be dangerous on this point, and see that everyone keeps their eyes open, that we don't close our eyes in prayer as we pray for let's say, for a more collective, integrated salvation. But we keep our eyes open as we pray, as we watch for the enemy, because who knows who is doing what when the eyes are closed. And that's essentially how there is a parity in the room, that there isn't one person speaking while everyone else has got their eyes closed, that at least if one person's going to be speaking, then everyone's eyes are open. Doesn't mean that it's incorrect that one person should speak and other people should be listening, but everyone's eyes should be open. Anyway, this is I'm ranting more, but I I should probably just put some context when I say that I have a Messiah complex. And I think how I get over my Messiah complex is with Christ consciousness. That it's an understanding that it has always been available to humanity. It's always been at hand. The kingdom of God has always been at hand, but no one willing to do the work, essentially, or not enough to pursue it. But also, let me say as well that I guess why I am particularly prone to this Messiah complex is, and I mean, hopefully I'm just a delusional crackpot, because I do have these really terrible beliefs and memories, which, I mean, I can only hope are just complete fantasy and fiction. Um, because so many of them, I mean, they're just crazy things. I mean, they're alien stories. They're you know, I mean, I believe I was part of genociding an entire planet because they attacked us before I was born in the 1960s or something. I mean, like, and I mean, all these crazy beliefs that are not really worth talking about. But I mean, I must say, let me contextualize this. This stuff is not that important anymore. This has become moot if my beliefs are anything to go by, because I essentially stood trial for that crime by myself in a kind of intergalactic context somewhere, um, which itself was very strange. Where I also then created a contract which essentially cordoned off our planet from other aliens. But this is very complicated and stupid to even talk about because it sounds so crazy. But essentially, the aliens that attacked us were not high-tech aliens. They were local, low-tech aliens. They only actually existed 14 light years away from us. And and the kind of aliens that I was put under trial of, because essentially I committed a taboo, which is that you're not supposed to destroy other people's planets. I mean, it was a bit of a useless planet. I mean, it was completely desolate at that point because this very low-tech species had basically destroyed the life on their planet. They were a kind of insect race, and they destroyed their own biosphere, and essentially they grew more intelligent after they receded into the bowels of their planet, and they concocted a way to make these spaceships. And I don't know how long it took them. I think they were better at space travel than we were. I mean, it took us 15 years to send a retaliatory force. I think it took them, no, yeah, it took us about, I think, 16 years in the 90s to attack them back. And then we just blew up their planet. No, that doesn't sound, I think it took us about 20 years, because I know it took us about 3 years or 2.5 years to basically, the fleet that we sent, which only had 30 human beings in it, and that was a one-way trip, and they kind of knew it was a one-way trip, and that I feel very bad about. Sending people to their deaths like that in the middle of space. Anyway, you see how crazy this sounds. I mean, this is basically the plot of Ender's Game, by the way, which is also why I think Ender's Game was a popular movie, because I do think certain things have a certain resonance. I mean, this is also why I think StarCraft 2 is so, or StarCraft is so popular in Korea and in other Southeast Asian countries, is because there's a resonance to that. It's in the collective consciousness to some degree. But anyway, I mean, this is all weird conspiracy story stuff, but talking about space shit is not useful, because it's not going to help us solve our problems. We don't need a narrative to live within, so it's better not to talk about all this crazy bullshit. But and we also have many local problems as well, which are other secret things that I won't mention them because they are not my secrets to tell. But supposedly I know about them, or I'm just a stupid crackpot. So yeah, I definitely am. I think it's called atypical. So yeah, I mean, I'm perhaps a lucid crazy person. Maybe that's what I am. And I must say, it would actually be nice to just be a delusional person, because some of the memories that I have are really very unpleasant. Um, it would be nice to think that those are just all illusory. Uh, I still think that my hand. I've been tortured more than once, actually, if my memories are true or not. So, which was always very strange to me, because those incidents were very odd incidents. They they didn't go according to plan, but anyway, they turned out all right, I guess. Um, but yeah, we have a lot of things to fix, and we have a lot of problems that don't have to, it would be nice if we could just live in a more evolved culture, but it's not going to happen all at once. And maybe, I've been infected. Maybe, a lot of weird things happen to me. I also think that, I've had shock treatment and things like that. So, who knows how many strange hypnotic suggestions are swirling around in my head. I really might be the victim of some kind of mind control and other forms of experimentation. That certainly happened to me quite concertedly when I was 7 years old. Um, there were these fucking Masons. What are they called? Hired by rich people. Anyway, this is family drama shit. I don't want to talk about it, but very unpleasant sort of. I've dealt with a lot of interference in my time, but I always had people to rely on, although it was not always easy to get a hold of them. But there's a lot of conflict, a lot of factionism or factionalism. Just surviving all of these things. Who knows? Saying things like this sound scary enough to some people, that because if I ever claimed my reputation, and if my reputation is not just crackpot delusions, but I actually was a part of all the things that I think that I've been a part of, I can't really be denied the things that I wish to claim, and I can't really be denied many things. In fact, because I've literally done the work. I've literally bled. I've done things that are themselves feats in themselves. But I've also can't say that I've done it all alone. There always have been people to work with and such. Uh, but I can't really say that. I can't really undersell myself. They are in some ways. I did put a lot of things in motion by my own inspiration, let's just say, or by, when I say my own inspiration, by I was inspired to what I was inspired from. I would say that the gift of prophecy is a strange sort of thing, to be God heard, which is, I believe, what the name Samuel means. God heard. Well, at least that's what my grandfather taught me. But my grandfather is, again, this might be a transpersonal sort of tacit self delusion in some sense. And I've been told so many stories about my lineage, and really, it's not worth delving into. But I mean, a lot of it really might be to a large extent, psychosis. I mean, it certainly runs in my family, mental health problems. But yes, it would actually be quite pleasant to work out what parts of these memories are literally delusion, and which of them bear resemblance to the truth. But I mean, there are some things that I just have too much of an intimate accounting of being, of going to Robben Island, of going to the Houses of Parliament, of being in conference rooms. Of contacting the ANC in exile, of using the Gazette even to send them messages to prove that I was doing what I said that I was doing in contacting those people in exile. But anyway, all these things have the political input that I've had has been probably somewhat poisoned by the fact that I've been focused on trying to develop the psychology, and therefore I have not been active all the time, although I have been sometimes activated to solve problems, glaring problems. Somewhat herding cats in systems that are fundamentally corrupt is very annoying. But I mean, it is also, the world itself is a very strange place. Like when you need to do a secret operation because you're literally trying to protect the planet, and you need to just find $1 trillion somewhere, and you have to take it from about 5 different industries, because in some sense you can't just hit one person up, you have to hit a combination of people up. Anyway, that's not that important, because that stuff doesn't really happen so much anymore. I think the only threat we've ever had are from people that aren't really a real threat to us anymore, because the planet itself sort of changed its magnetic thing to make it so that they couldn't live here anymore without getting sick, at least. Anyway, this is all very strange. But yeah, it would be nice to bring peace to a lot of the frozen conflicts which don't go anywhere, because we have this very strange deep state, and this very strange, somewhat necessary division. Because in some sense, imagine if you had the kind of technology that the deep state has available to anyone and everyone. The planet wouldn't last probably a decade. Someone would set off a fusion chain reaction or something like that. I mean, you just need an understanding in calculus and some intelligence, and you could devise something that someone could do something with, that would essentially, I mean, the destructive forces are not, you don't, there's some actions which are just so, the technical sweetness, the crisis of the technical sweetness in some sense. I mean, this is on the culture. I mean, people, say, oh, capitalism. The problem is that our morality has not grown to the extent that our technical capabilities have grown. But in some sense, I think that's a misnomer of the whole problem. That's a whole misreading of the problem. The problem is people themselves. The problem is more cultural, is more sociological. This is why I've always thought that in some sense there's no getting around the culture, that eventually we do need to attain towards that level of malleability in our capacity for choosing our form of life to some degree. Perhaps that won't necessarily blunt the wedge of malevolence, but it will at least say, well, let us help you migrate to a different state of being if you so wish to leave the culture. But, in some sense, you can't, the only thing that you can't guard against is essentially a malevolent spirit that just wants to take everything down with itself into an abyss or into something like that. But in some sense, I do think that can always be readily diagnosed as having a particular. I do think that this is why psychology is important, because on the individual, I think that there is a way to address that. In some sense, you can't address that problem on a sociological solution. You have to address that on an individual psyche solution. And then it is solvable. Anyway, I've babbled on and on and on enough about this kind of stuff. I need to write my book. I can't even remember where I left off the last recording, but I just had some conversations with some other people. And I just feel like emphasizing some of the strains that I've already outlined, but I think now I've crystallized for myself a bit more, that essentially the problem with the French legal system in some sense is that the revolution never ended. And that's why they don't have a justice system. They have an inquisition. They have a system of inquisitive judicial it really it's kind of it has the fascist sort of mob mentality to it, that essentially that you must conform to the bundle, to the collective of, and this is a gross way to do what I think is important, that the commons is a sociological metaphor, and the only way to properly, let's say, recommon things or something like that is to recommon your values. And that means that you actually need a real system of adjudication, not an inquisitor. You don't need an inquisitor judge, you need a judge that allows the parties themselves to refine their cases and to adjudicate between those cases, that they are responsible for making those cases and making the claims that they make, or failing to make the claims that they want to make. That then the burden is in the right place, because then you have this idea that you don't have to prove your innocence against the revolution that's never ending, but you have to have the wherewithal that you actually have your affairs in order that you can make your case in court, or at least make good enough excuses as to why you can't make your case in court because of the unjust structure at work against you, or something like that. That there are countervailing factors and things like that. And this also means that then the state must be organized to protect the integrity of its own structures and institutions. And this is essentially why rights then become very important, and why essentially there's the general common law repository, that you have whatever right that you wish to claim, essentially the right of claim. You don't have to wait for the revolution to give you the right, or something like that, and then you live in this confected narrative. So in some sense, I think that the French, let's say, idea of trying to create a commons, not that they were trying to do that overtly, but in some sense, they have created a lowest common denominator, which itself is so subject to corruption of the narrative, that there's not even a real adjudication process in this sense, because the individual is not sovereign. The culture is itself sovereign. So, this is why I say, and I tried to make this point in my first recording, in response to the Dialogos, that essentially the concept of sovereignty and the concept of the commons cannot be separated. And in some sense, therefore, we cannot try to say, oh, let's try to revive the commons. The commons never functioned properly. It like it had all the ingredients, but in some sense, it never functioned. It only functioned because of the authoritarian power of the sovereign seat in control of everything. And if we want to devolve sovereignty, we are going to have to understand that we're not going to be able to have our cake and eat it. That there are some people that don't want to be sovereign, perhaps, or in some sense, you have to sociologically have a solution to people that don't want to be sovereign, and then you also have to have an individual solution, which is that you reach out to them and you say, I think I understand psychology, and I think I know what your problem is, and I think we can talk it out. But if you don't want to, you have the right not to want to talk it out. But then don't involve me. I don't want to be welded to your fate in some sense, because then we have this horrible ambiguity. The peasants are revolting. The peasants are revolting. Did I say two things there, or did I say the same thing twice? And the ambiguity of the peasants are revolting is: are they revolutionary? In that sense, they are revolting, or are they themselves putrefied in their malcontented, self-absorbed whatever, and in some sense there are forms of dysfunction which are very hard to treat, because you cannot compel someone to seek help, and you shouldn't necessarily compel someone to seek help, but then there needs to be some kind of, you can't save these people from reality in some sense. So it's weird. Out of respect for the dignity of their self-determinism, you have to allow them to languish in whatever narrative that they so wish to confect, or whatever. Anyway, I do think that, though, if the hard structures in society, the judicial structure, and let's say the field of psychology and psychiatry can be reformed and improved, then at least we can remove a lot of injustice, I think. But in some sense, there will have to be an understanding of compromise, and I've kind of already explored this in the concept of the practice of equality, that essentially you cannot say that, oh, it's sad that you can't make your own case because you wish your own values and morality to be private. There's something fundamentally incoherent about that. You cannot be demanding, essentially, equality to something that you won't even be honest about your own understanding. You can't expect the same outcome as somebody else who perhaps understands what it is that they're doing, and you want to be private about what your understanding is, because it doesn't. Anyway, I'm very poorly re-articulating it, but it's in the recording. So anyway, but I do think that there's a lot of this, let's say, I don't know how to say this without it sounding like a pointed critique or something like that, but in some sense, a lot of the time it's not a problem of being irrational. It's a problem of, let's say, not chunking the problem correctly and wishing to live a homogenized existence. In some sense, I think I see that a lot of the liberal mentality is in this single mode of being, that it just wants to have this homogeneous experience, and it wants to say, well, I've been completely consistent and coherent, and I want to live in one way, and that one way doesn't have an internal ramped up modulation to it. It doesn't have a fluctuation in it. It's not. It just wants to be a kind of consistent slow slog. It wants to have a permanent mode, and that doesn't modulate itself or vary itself with any kind of dynamic calibration. It wants to have, it wants to be safe it just wants to find the right frequency to vibrate at, and then it wants to exist in that frame. And in some sense, I think that kind of wish is a bit of wishful thinking. And in some sense, you can say, well, that's my personal proclivity, that's my personal preference, or something like that. Um, and in so doing, it can also protect itself from having to, let's say, garner experiences that would break its uh, frame of reference, or at least its narrative that it uses. I mean, I do think that there is this wanton desire for convenient reductions and sociological generalizations, which are very easy to rely on, and therefore to create enough of it's almost like a perverse ideological incentive to be objective about your morality. That essentially, well, if we can just stay in the generalized frame, then we can hope to create a cookie cutter solution that will kind of be a one size fits all, lowest common denominator sort of thing. And I do think that life can actually never be that way in some sense. It does require a higher understanding. It does require a better understanding. But that kind of dynamism is, I think, quite alien to at least the game that we're living in, that we have perhaps been encultured into. But in some sense, I do think that this is more from the French corruption. This is more, or that I think also existed in America independently, perhaps. I mean, perhaps I shouldn't use Napoleon to excuse the Americans for having their own quite similar cultural induction into this I mean, I do think that in some sense Hamilton was a toxic individual. I do think Hamilton was a greedy revolutionary, and he saw revolution as a means to increasing his station, and I think that he could lie to himself quite easily with the French spirit in some sense of again, this is a malapropism for me to make this juxtaposition, but anyway. Um, but I do think that it is a young revolutionary mentality, um, and in some sense, I think it preserves its naivety by essentially not putting itself in a place that it would find compromising and challenged, which is essentially to actually have a surplus, to actually have surplus power and resources, and then work out, well, how should I administer this? How should I actually allocate my resources? That I mean, I perhaps suffer from this as well. I mean, I am always sort of living on ends meet or something like that, within quite a comfortable, I would say. But I mean, essentially, it's because I have no thought for the morrow to some degree. Like, I mean, I don't have, if maybe I'll inherit something, and then I will be able to retire rather than commit suicide or something like that if I run out of funds, because I'm essentially wholly dependent. But and I mean, I have in some sense I've just put my life on hold. Well, in the sense of, I mean, I'm a bit of a monk in some sense. Well, not strictly so, but I mean, in the sense that I I'm just quite open about the fact that I can't have a family. I can't have a family life. I can't have a relationship, and in some sense, I'm a waste of time for many women, because uh, women need a breadwinner essentially. Uh, but anyway, so I've chosen my path, and I still have hope that maybe I can still have a normal life. I mean, for men it's much easier than it is for women. I mean, I'm 34 years old, so presuming that I'm still fertile by the time that I publish my book, maybe I can make some money off of that. And if I self-publish it, then I can tell people, well, if you can't afford it, then just steal it off the internet. You have my permission, and I'm not going to sue you. you know, um, maybe I can have my cake and eat it. Who knows? But to me, that's somewhat not that important. Um, I have my priorities, and as I've said in the recording that this is adjacent to, I have a bit of a messiah complex. So for me, it's perhaps it's not that hard for me, or it would be harder for me to do something else. But I guess it does slightly disgust me, though, that I feel a bit sorry for myself. But I've been told uh, by some people that I believe that I used to be very close friends with, that have now deceased and departed, but that you start growing less sorry for yourself the older you get. It gets a bit easier. You don't feel sorry for yourself that you've kind of when you get a bit older and frailer, it's somewhat easier, I think, to just commit yourself into uh, the life of the hermit, essentially. But so I have something to look forward to, probably. Uh, and I mean, public life might be open to me, but it also might be a way that I get assassinated as well, because I'll probably be a bit of a firebrand in politics if I do get involved in politics. And I'll probably make a lot of enemies or a lot of Stark. Um, anyway, but so I want to hold off on entering into public life if I do try to enter into public life until I've published my book. So at least my research isn't all for naught, because that would really. I mean, I must say, I am afraid of dying. I'm very much afraid of dying until I've actually fully culminated my research, because I mean, it's been a life devoted to that. I mean, literally my entire life. I'm not even exaggerating. From the age of 7, well, I already knew that I was going to essentially do something from the age of 4. Even from the age of 3, I was somewhat involved in things that I half understood. And then from the age of 4, I already committed myself to doing something. From the age of 7, I started designing and planning the project. From the age of 10, I started executing the project. And at the age of 23, it was kind of the crucial part. It kind of really, well, I mean, it's still ongoing, and I'm 34 years old. So, I mean, essentially, I've 27 years. I mean, it's older. I mean, as a fraction, what's 27 years over 34? What is that fraction? I mean, it's roughly 4/5. No, have some exact. No, yeah, it's, well, when I'm 35, it'll be 5 times 7 is 35. So it'll be 6 when I'm 35. It'll be 6/7. So it must at least be 4/5. 4/5 of my life, essentially, to this project. So yes, I am very afraid of dying. I do not want to die until I publish my book. I'll be very fucking happy when I publish my book and I feel like that my research is preserved, because it's for me, it's been hard won, and I must say I am nervous. I mean, I say this with a bit of tongue in cheek, perhaps, that I'm afraid of dying. I'm afraid of dying. That's why I release my research notes, because if anything does happen to me, I want there to be someone that at least. I mean, well, I'm almost finished now, so anyway, um, hopefully I won't have to be nervous for that much longer. um, it would be nice to naturalize my life, but in some sense, I think I'll always be a freak, because uh, I mean, I never really had a childhood. Anyway, but let me avoid the self pity. Um, I mean, I've probably made up for it in other ways, but in some ways that's just alienated me incredibly. But oh my word, I could go so deeply into the self pity; it's disgusting. And in some sense, indulging in that kind of self pity is only excusable if I tell people, but no, it's not just all these secrets and intrigue and interesting things. I was also actually in agony. I was actually tortured. Maybe it's just a crazy delusion that I had. Maybe I'm just a very I think it's called atypal personality disorder. Maybe I'm just an atypal personality freakazoid essentially. But anyway, I certainly have too many stories to tell about how I've been involved in too many things. Anyway, what was I talking about? Lose my thread. The French Revolution, the narratives. Yeah, again, I guess I just think that the whole liberal mentality, to some degree, the sociological reductiveness, is an amoral framework, and it rests on its laurels before it, it pretends to have a kind of objectivism about it. It's the same critique that I have against Sam Vaknin, which I will say I do think that his intellectualism, I mean, in some sense, look, I mean, Russia itself was a bit of a fuck up as well after the revolution. It's kind of sad that they didn't keep their aristocracy, because when they had their backs against the wall, the aristocracy did actually give in to reforms. But the Red Army was not happy, and they wanted full control, and in some sense I think there was something more insidious behind all of that as well. Um, but the West lost a lot of its culture in the Russian Revolution. Um, and in some sense it was in the flavor of Napoleon. But yeah, I mean, I guess all I am doing is being very pessimistic about revolutionaries, because I just see them perpetuating the same bullshit. They just do it under a new narrative, under a new hmm, promulgating a new form of amoral. Uh, and there is a problem, I think, that essentially when people think that they can just kind of, you shouldn't try to have a one size fits all solution. I mean, also, just by the way, in my system, which I haven't even spoken about, you don't have to go to court. You can just have a notary settle the whole matter with notices and notarial, putting people to terms in a notarial process, which is actually how peers do it, is actually how you negotiate the points of law that govern the case. Essentially, if the notarial process does fail, but if you're clever enough in the notarial process, you will actually be able to fashion and engineer quite a happy sort of. But I mean, a lot of people aren't interested in that, because sovereignty is not something that people are actually interested in at the end of the day. They just want a better lot. And that kind of consumerism, that kind of. I mean, this is why the world is in the corrupted state that it's in. And this is why I really dislike the so called sort of democratic, so called liberal, these people that are liberal, but they're not classically liberal. And they are really trying to gut the system of whatever whatever potential it had of actually supporting a real commons. They want a cookie cutter. they want something served up on a silver dish. Which was famously how John the Baptist met his fate. Anyway, it just shows you, I think, that there are themes here which are perennial, because they are appended to the human condition, and until we confront the human condition and actually seek to solve that problem, we should put everything else on the back burner. I don't think we should dance to some emergency tune, especially something that seems to justify the slide into a further, I wanted to say the Afrikaans word, gemors, messy situation. If I think I've got that word right, I'm not actually sure. Man, I think I literally failed Afrikaans in matric. I got a condoned pass. I always like listening to it though. I always got these strange visions whenever I listen to Afrikaans. Such an emotive language. Oh, I'm really babbling. Okay, let me stop this embarrassing recording. But yes, I mean, I spoke about this as well, essentially the cult of sympathy, and how sympathy doesn't help us resolve the problem that the peasants are revolting. The peasants are revolting. And people don't realize the problems within that ambiguity. And they're not willing to confront those problems when they're blinded by sympathy. And this is where I am a student of Marx, and I say that we are just going to be doomed to repeat a cycle of history. But in some sense, I guess I'm more a Hegelian than a Marxist, in that I think that there's an immaterial dialectism that we have to work out here in terms of psychology, I guess. But I mean, and the law itself as well. Anyway, I guess a lot of people still think that this is esoteric, and in some sense, I don't offer simple answers to all problems, but people don't want to get their ducks in a row. They just want the fireworks, it seems to me. These are perhaps a bit too vague as retorts. But in some sense, I do think that the style of the revolution, which is an inquisition, which demands you to prove your innocence, and then demands that you incline yourself to ingratiate yourself to the inquisitor judge. This is a society that has lost all decorum or all etiquette or boundary, and that it cannot sustain a sovereign understanding. It cannot sustain a sovereign individual. It in some sense says that the collective is sovereign. The fascist is sovereign. And so everyone is then de facto inducted into this fascist mode of cultural vanguardism. And it's fucking disgusting. And I mean, this is why I call these people proto-fascists as well. But essentially, they are happy to devolve into this sociological reductionism. They are happy to rest on these generalizations, because it makes everything manageable, and then you can kind of have the supposedly objective armchair moral arbitration over society, and its components of society, and you can just say, well, rich people are this faction, and middle class people are this faction, and lower class people are this faction, and you completely miss the trees from the wood from the trees, as the saying goes. There's no gradation. There's no gradation of psychology in some sense. It's just this kind of this blithe, thumb-sucked, well, if we don't have enough diversity of life experience, I mean, let me tell you what enough life experience is. Just if you're middle class, that's enough fucking life experience. Thank you very much. If you're middle class and you've been around people that are lower class and you've been around some people that are upper class, you have enough life experience if you're middle class. Because that's what middle class means. That means that you're in contact with it all. You know, you went to school with people that were poorer than you. You played with children that came from poorer households. You're in a, you know, that's life experience. In fact, that's better life experience than someone who is impoverished. I mean, Jesus Christ was not a poor person, just by the way. Interestingly enough, Jesus Christ was no way poor at all. Jesus Christ was the son of a carpenter in the fucking Stone Age. He was middle class. Just as an interesting aside. So I mean, I have, you know, I have no. It says, you know, the poor and the meek will inherit the earth. What does that actually mean? I mean, this is a spiritual document. This is not talking about material things. It says the rich man is hard for a rich man to reach the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. What does this mean? Who are rich and who are poor? Many poor people who are impoverished are very, very rich in their conceit and impudence, are very, very rich in their lack of curiosity because they have a narrative. They're rich in narrative and they're poor in interrogation. They don't go seeking for the truth in some sense. And there are many rich people, sons of rich people, who are very inquisitive, who know that they don't know. In some sense, they've exhausted. They've worked out that money can't buy a lot of things, and they've worked out how hollow. I mean, Peter Thiel is a perfect example of this. Peter Thiel is a wonderfully righteous person. I mean, he's in some sense, Eric is much more decadent than Peter Thiel is. I mean, Eric has got the Portal podcast, and Peter Thiel is like, oh, this seems a bit hypothetical to me. This seems a bit highfalutin. Like, where are you arriving at this? And you know, Eric is a bit of a more of a perhaps a left wing radical socialist, perhaps, and Peter Thiel understands that actually there is something to the ambiguity of the peasants are revolting. The peasants are revolting. But no, you know, and Peter Thiel has made beautiful speeches on Pere Girard's mimetic work and things like that. So understand that you know these people are friends, but they have disagreements, and maybe Peter Thiel knows something that Eric doesn't know that Eric needs to learn, that Eric still hasn't fully digested, perhaps. And I'm just saying this in general, but essentially this is the problem with narratives and sympathy, is that sympathy is a very blinding force. I mean, anyway, I can complain about a lot of people. I think Brett also has this issue. But I mean, this is what happens when you rest on these reductive generalizations and sociological narratives. You blind yourself. And I think that there's a lot of self-deception that goes along with this, especially when you homogenize yourself into, let's say, the archetypal fascist, so that you can be a man of the people, so that you're keeping your political powder dry, perhaps. I think that this is a bit of a vanity, perhaps, to some degree. I realize how insulting that this might be. I don't mean this in a mean-spirited way, but I do think that there is a hard lesson here that let's love the enemy before we are so quick to judge them, is basically what I'm saying. Let's work out if there's something to be loved in the enemy if there's some piece of the puzzle that they are not. Uh, but yeah, this idea of being conditioned. I mean, I talked about this in my recording, and I guess now I'm just emphasizing it. But this idea of being conditioned by the technical environment or something like that, I really do not actually buy into that. I see that there's a lot of opportunity, even in this system that is, I think, overrun by centralized state control and over regulation and overreach that infantilizes people even further. Um, in some sense, I do think that a lot of the economic woes that we face are something of a political irresponsibility. I mean, first of all, immigration, or not immigration, but migration, is obviously going to depress wages. And Bernie Sanders wanted to stop migration because he said migration was for the big corporates, that they wanted it, not, it's bad for the population. And how quickly did he flip flop on that because of this new social justice warrior proto-fascist nonsense? So something that was a left-wing position is now not a left-wing position. I mean, how crazy is this? Trump tries to put obstacles for migration to help real wages in America. Trump gets record black unemployment figures, or record minority unemployment figures, and they still call him a racist. I mean, does no one have ears? Does no one have eyes to see the unreality that is being peddled on the so-called liberal left? I mean, this is hypocrisy, and anyway, I mean, there's no point in complaining about it, but essentially, this is what I feel is actually, this is writ large what I see revolutionaries trying to push when they use narratives, um, which are always convenient. Why is the narrative always convenient for your cause? Uh, I mean, I will concede that I do actually don't believe I don't believe in climate change as being caused by carbon. I think that climate will be changing because we're coming out of the little ice age, but I also think that climate is not really the problem. I mean, climate will be a problem for agriculture, but what will be more of a problem is pollution and the health of the seas and things like that. Um, and I do think that a lot of this climate change stuff is a huge distraction on that. Um, but I do think also that the climate is going to be more inhospitable because things are going to get warmer because we're coming out of the hollow. What is it called? The holoplastine. I don't even know what the terms are, but I mean, and you can say, well, who am I to say these sorts of things? Well, I'm people that have listened to the people who actually designed the computer models that is where all the climate science supposedly comes from. And the guy who actually invented the computer models says that they're being abused. That this is not evidence-based science. This is madness. This is blasphemy to science. It's politically contrived bullshit, essentially. And look, it is true that the climate is so complicated and we don't understand it at all that 10 years after we have a cataclysmic climate change, then we'll only start to maybe have the opportunity to understand what actually went wrong after it goes wrong, because that's how complicated it is. But I mean, there's also a lot of evidence in the other direction. I mean, if you look at actually, um, we could have 320 parts per million carbon according to the ice core samples, and that's not that uh, unnatural for this planet. Thank you very much. So, what's really going on here? And even within, let's say, civilizational living history, um, the Roman Empire used to be fed almost exclusively from Egypt. And then Egyptian agriculture finished. Egyptian agriculture dried up. The Nile stopped being fertile, essentially. Uh, that's climate change. That wasn't caused by carbon. The climate changes. Uh, anyway, these narratives are. Anyway. But these narratives, I still see a positive side to everything. It's not bad that people are being misled by crazy bullshit. Um, because if they fall for it, then maybe they need to fall for it because we need a new cultural edifice. We need a new system or something like that. But let's not rush the process and install something that is just as bad or retrograde. Why would we dismantle something that we could improve, essentially? Why would burning everything down we would have a better chance to make it afresh? How does that make any fucking sense? It does not, in fact. But anyway, I'm kind of making arguments at phantoms that I'm projecting in my mind, so it's a bit unfair. But anyway, just some food for thought, perhaps. But I do think that there is a lot of false moral panic that has been created out of identity politics, out of the sociological reductionism and thematic, sort of this demanding of the sympathy. I must say this demand for inclusivity. If you want to meet black classical liberals, just come to my country. I can introduce you to a lot of them. I can't. I only know one of them that has a YouTube channel. It's much more popular than my YouTube channel, but uh, if that's what you're looking for, if you're just looking for a token or something like that, and and I'm not saying that these people are tokens in themselves, but I'm saying if that is your criteria, that you need to check boxes, but what's the point? Uh, I have the freedom to be online and to influence and to be maybe a thought leader in my strange way, in my strange covert way, because I'm time rich, and I'm time rich because in some way I've made sacrifices. Although I guess some people would say I live very comfortably, um, and this is a relative thing, I guess. I can't even add together. My salary is $250 a month, but I only buy half of the food that I eat, I would say. Um, and I have free use of a car that I don't own, but I can use it to travel. But I do chores as well for people in my family. So I've got but yeah, I live a very comfortable existence apart from the fact that I don't really have a future. But except if I can publish my book, then maybe everything will come together for me. So which in some sense, the success of my book or perhaps be a little bit of a validating thing that, did I actually make a contribution or not? I mean, in some sense, I don't care about the commercial success. I care about let's say, the academic acclaim, because I do actually want to reforge psychology. I mean, I want to completely remove psychology as it currently stands and displace it with a new system, which is probably not going to necessarily happen, because my psychology is so Jungian in essence that you might need a wholly different form of academy in order to support it, um, because it has a kind of spiritual element to it, or a spiritual metaphysics in some sense. I mean, I can relate it, I think, very cleverly to Platonic metaphysics, um, but at some point it does probably smack too much of Christian doctrine, that a lot of people, the Trinity and such, that not everyone is going to fly with that. But in some sense, I think that there might be ways to secularize it, because I mean, I can talk about it in a secular way, and in some sense, I only use the phrase Holy Ghost as a way to invoke an archetype that then I can build on, that I can describe and explain. And I think it is a useful label and heading. And in some sense, it's just another dimension of psychological reality, the Holy Ghost. And then you could talk about the condition of the Holy Ghost in a particular psyche in some sense. And then there are ways in which, because we communicate between ourselves, that the particular anatomy of someone's false ego is going to have a certain karmic broadcast into what I call a field circuit. And so we have these field circuits in which people are fighting over each other's they're fighting over the occupation of each other's false ego complexes, and then there are ways of regulating this within organizations. And I do think that in some sense the academy is one of these corrupted organizations, because it has sort of been cultishly taken over by what I would call the cult of introverted thinking, in a kind of nihilistic introverted thinking. The idea that introverted thinking can actually tell you what is correct or incorrect, when introverted thinking can only tell you if something is self-consistent or not. And I will say as well that I innovated that concept. I've noticed that a lot of people already believe that now. When I talk about it, they said, yes, I've had the same inclination. So I think the waves of my dissemination have gotten into the typology to some degree, but I think I've somewhat won that battle. You see, I've been fighting this culture war longer than anyone else, actually. Which is why when people get on my radar, sometimes I suss them out and I try to improve them to some degree. I mean, I did that to Sargon of Akkad, which he might not appreciate me saying that, but essentially I can just be a crazy person babbling about things that I imagine, so maybe that'll be okay. But, people forget how rough Sargon was, and it took me essays in his comment section, and then also stalking him on, I can't remember if it was TeamSpeak or something, or it was something before Discord, I think. But anyway, I mean, I've been involved with other people, I guess, in the culture wars, but for me to talk about that, it would be to speak out of turn, and it would also be to say strange things. But let me talk about this jazz. This is uncomfortable for me to say, but essentially, I skipped over making this point, but it really rubbed me the wrong way. That essentially that jazz should only be defined as the reaction of people, the music of people that are being oppressed. That jazz is somehow canonically narrated as being the reaction of oppressed people via music, instead of the expression of some truth which is yet inarticulate. And I do think jazz is a good metaphor for the process of synthesis from hypothek. That essentially, when you have jazz, you have a hypothek, you have a hope, but you don't yet have the synthesis of the hope, and you are trying to synthesize it with others. And it's I do think, as an analogy, I mean, it's a double-edged analogy in some sense. It's not all good, it's not all bad. It's not wrong, it's not right. But it's a way of saying that you don't understand what it is that you're doing, but you know what it is that you're trying to do. You know what it sounds like in some way, but not the way that it should sound, or the way that it should sound like. And that should is somewhat, well, now I've just articulated, let's say, the crux, what I consider to be the crux of jazz, is this idea that some people have that the should just be left out, that we can solve that another day, that can be the esoteric window dressing after the fact, after we've got our meat and potatoes delivered to us, because we need that in the interim. I know that this is sloppy for me to say this and will incense some people, but again, this is a real ambiguity that we really have to fucking understand, or we're going to just make another bloodbath, another historical, half-witted, fudged solution. The peasants are revolting, the ambiguity of that. You really need to be able to say it's not wrong, but it's not right. If you can't even have the truthfulness, or at least the sensitivity to make that admission, I think, then there isn't enough carefulness in the space to actually move anything in any real progressive direction. Anyway, I've babbled on for long enough, but I know, I guess some people will think, okay, this is an unfair characterization perhaps, but I'm still going to make it, because I do think that there is something true to this, which is that these Democrats have destroyed states. They have gutted them culturally. They have destroyed people's self-determinism and self-ownership to a large extent. They have degraded the concept of responsibility, and the idea that somehow now the problem is just that we need to be more radical. We somehow just need to be more radical and lean into game B even harder and rip away from game A, is just in some way to try to create a gated variant, some kind of gated enclave of essentially the continuation of the democratic doubling down. Um, and although it might be a utopia in material terms, what will actually make it even worse is that moralistically it will be an infantilism. It will be a moral tyranny, a moralistic tyranny. It will be a moralistic authoritarianism. And this is to me the greatest threat of Game B, or this is the greatest conundrum of Game B. This is to me is the real crux of it, is that we do actually need to have a secular space so that we do not create moral authoritarianism. We do need to have a way in which people can go and be nomads and to be goats and to be whatever they want to be. And obviously within some framework, and I do think that framework is something like the British liberal mentality or something like that. So at least then they can still keep their human visage. They can still have some kind of categorical view of certain things. Um, and perhaps there should be a way that their children, if they so wish, want to join the culture, that they can do so. Um, but this idea that there's this kind of all or nothing sort of thing, or there's this idea that we must automatically be inclusive and things like that. I mean, this is. I can sympathize with the sentiment, but now this is just sympathy upon sympathy upon sympathy, and where does the buck stop, and where does the bootstrapping start? And this is a real practical problem, and you have to solve that problem before you start this chain of endless sympathy, which essentially I've described it, I think, poetically in the sense that you are moving towards the future, an image of yourself in the future that is rich in sympathy, and therefore the means will always be justified by that end. And you can slither through it, and you will be dead in some sense. You will feel the hunger of your belly. You will feel and you will be camouflaged by your conditioning, be camouflaged by the world and your environment, and you have no boundary between you and your environment. You're part of it, and you have to look the part. You have to blend in. And why is this? Because you're not willing to chunk it. You're not willing to take more responsibility, because you want to make it slow and steady, slithering there. You don't want to walk there upright on your legs. Because you don't want to run. You want to walk there. Well, no, you also need to be able to run. And maybe if you're not able to run, then maybe it's not for you. Or maybe, in some sense, the thing that you're going to create on your walk to this walking revolution is going to be just another half-baked, half-bred, chunked, unchunked, uh, uh, homogenized, neutered. It's just going to be the French Revolution 2.0 or something, or it's going to be the next republic or something. Um, anyway, those are my concerns, I guess. Maybe I'm being a bit hyperbolic and overly pedantic about my particular esoteric obsessions. And maybe I'm being under informed about the environmental. Uh, maybe my views are just convenient, but I believe that in these matters it's better to talk to polymaths than it is to talk to experts in the field, because I think that there are no experts in the field of climate science. Uh, they're all so much. They're all pretty much ravaged by the political perverse incentives in the system. But anyway,